Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final panel or presentation for today. My name is Ryan Stoa. I am an associate professor of law at the Southern University Law Center in Baton Rouge. I'm also a fellow in the Law Center's Cannabis Compliance Law and Policy Institute. Now, I've been at the Law Center. This will be my second year here. I was previously a law professor at Concordia University in Boise, Idaho, and before that, Florida International University in Miami, Florida. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to give a shout out and many thanks to the director of the Cannabis Compliance Law and Policy Institute, Marla Dickerson, for her tireless efforts organizing this symposium every year. And for inviting me and collaborating with me and sort of giving all of us this platform just to speak to each other and share so many fascinating insights about the cannabis industry as it continues to evolve so quickly. I know on our agenda, the title of this presentation is Cannabis Legal Issues. I'm going to be a little bit more specific than that today. I'm going to primarily be discussing and talking about cannabis agriculture, the cultivation aspects or sector of the cannabis industry. And in particular, within that topic, I'm going to try to highlight some equity challenges that cannabis agriculture has faced and is likely to continue to face into the future. So my goal today is to hit three primary topics. One is to talk about the structure of the cannabis industry as it pertains specifically to agriculture or cultivation, both in terms of growing styles and the scope of cannabis cultivation, and some of the ways in which the industry is still grappling with methods of cultivation and what really cannabis agriculture is going to look like, what the cannabis farm of the future is going to look like. Secondly, I want to talk about state licensing, which might not sound super sexy, but it's really state licensing right now that is driving the shape of the cannabis industry and really determining what our cannabis agriculture, what our cannabis farms look like today, and likely what they're going to look like tomorrow and into the future. And then finally, I want to talk about inclusion and fair labor, specifically cannabis farm workers. We talk a lot when we do talk about cannabis agriculture and the stakeholders involved. We often do talk about growers or business owners. Sometimes lost in that discussion are the farm workers or trimmers that face their own unique set of challenges within this industry. So before I get going, I just want to say a quick word about terminology. In my view, the terminology or the words that we use in this industry are still evolving as the industry evolves. You saw many of the sort of statutes or laws pertaining to cannabis in the past discuss marijuana, often marijuana spelled with an H and not a J, and more recently, perhaps more movement towards referring to the industry as cannabis. When I first started doing research on this topic back in 2014, 2015, I was primarily referring to cannabis plants, or especially psychoactive plants, as marijuana. And I was asked kindly by a growers association, essentially a trade industry group advocating on behalf of growers, to stop using the word marijuana and to start using the word cannabis. And their main concern was that marijuana just doesn't sound very professional. It sounds too colloquial. They wanted people to start using cannabis because they're pushing towards normalization and legalization and acceptance by society. So sure, I started referring more to cannabis in sort of a big picture sense. And subsequent to that, I was talking about terminology and the like, and a consumer rights advocate in the cannabis space of Mexican American heritage sort of objected to that and said, look, the word marijuana it has Hispanic roots, and we should honor that and sort of embrace that and own that, and sort of not be dismissive of marijuana as this term that we need to sort of do away with because it's unprofessional. So I still don't know exactly what words we are important to use. I think it is good and valuable to discuss that, or to have that conversation, and to be thoughtful about the words that we're using. In this talk, I might sort of use the term marijuana to refer to that sort of definition that a lot of states have, and that you heard Dr. Knox talk about in her presentation of cannabis plants with 0.3% or higher THC content as sort of that psychoactive cannabis plant, and hemp as those cannabis plants that have under 0.3% THC. But as she talks about, the sort of distinction there is a little bit ambiguous. So there's not really perhaps a pharmacologically sound distinction between marijuana or hemp. A lot of these plants are cannabis or cannabis sativa, and what you want to call them really depends on perhaps their THC content in a legal sense, or other factors. But so I say that just to throw out there that some of this terminology is still evolving. So let me start. A little bit of background about myself. As I mentioned, I've been researching cannabis for about 5 or 6 years now. And I started my academic career primarily doing research on water rights and freshwater conflicts in the United States and around the world. And around 2014 or 2015, especially the winter, spring of 2015, I was, surveying the landscape of water conflicts in the United States, and I was seeing some really interesting water conflicts popping up in the American West, and in particular in California. They were marijuana grows that were getting busted by the state of California. Now that in itself is not very remarkable. Those grows have been getting busted for quite some time. But the reason for those busts was pretty novel and quite interesting. They weren't getting busted because they were growing cannabis or marijuana. They were getting busted because they were making illegal water diversions, right? So they were taking water from nearby streams or water courses or rivers in order to irrigate sort of outdoor grows. And there was concern from the state that was not leaving enough water in those waterways for certain populations of, in particular, salmon. And so they started getting busted, they started getting fined, and their sort of plants were getting cut. And from there, that sort of took off, and I've been doing research on cannabis ever since. I now have, and started meeting and working with and spending a lot of time in Northern California in that sort of Emerald Triangle where historically much of American cannabis cultivation has taken place. I've done a lot of farmer surveys in Humboldt County in Northern California, Siskiyou County, and as well in Southern Oregon. In 2018, I wrote a book on the topic, which I happen to have here with me. It's called Craft Weed, Family Farming, and the Future of the Marijuana Industry. And that book was kind of the culmination of a few years of doing research on cannabis agriculture and cultivation. In the book, I sort of take a big picture look at what cannabis agriculture looks like in the United States, and ways in which consumers and policymakers can ensure that that agricultural sector looks like what we want it to look like in the future. I advocate for cannabis cultivation to remain relatively small scale, to remain where it can, artisanal, to be promoted locally, to be environmentally sustainable, and to be socially equitable. Those are a lot of really big goals, as you can imagine, and it's very challenging to accomplish all of those. But I sort of am going to use today's talk to highlight some of the points that I've been, or the research that I've been conducting, the observations I've been making, and some of the sort of trajectories that I have been advocating for. So I'll spend, I hope to spend about 30 to 40 minutes speaking on these topics, and then I'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. All right, so let's get started with the first topic. And that is industry structure. What does the cannabis industry look like, and what is it going to look like in the future? So historically, in the illicit market in the United States, cannabis cultivations, of course, illegal on both the federal level and the state level. In that case, cultivation took two different forms. In many places, it was grown indoors, sort of away from the prying eyes of law enforcement, in someone's basement or in a warehouse somewhere, maybe a walk-in closet. It was taking place indoors, and you know, there's been a rise of sort of indoor agriculture in recent years, sort of vertical farming, so to speak, and a lot of those technologies and of those developments really owe their advancements to the cannabis industry that's really been growing indoors for several decades now. Alternatively, in places where the climate, soil, general growing conditions were acceptable or feasible, cannabis was being grown outdoors. Now, when it was illegal on both state and federal levels, there weren't a lot of advantages to growing on privately owned property. So a lot of these grows were trespass grows or so-called guerrilla grows. They were grown on, often on national forest lands in the American West, thinking again to that area in Northern California where there's water during the winter, but plenty of sunshine during the summer. These are former logging regions. Well, there's not a lot of people, but there are a lot of roads to access some remote locations where the growing conditions are particularly hospitable. And so historically on the illicit market, you saw outdoor growing sort of on public lands or perhaps indoor growing, in people's homes. In the last, I would say 10 to, in California's case, 20 years or so, there's been a transition away from that, cannabis cultivation taking place more on private property, even outdoor and in indoor contexts. You've seen a couple of our presenters talk about and make distinctions between indoor and outdoor agriculture. So I want to spend some time talking about that, how that's developed, and sort of the advantages of the two, and how we might think about that in the future. And then secondly, I want to talk about the scope of cannabis cultivation as far as industry structure is concerned. Are we going to be talking about and seeing, a few really, really large cannabis farms in the future supplying most of the market, or are we going to continue to see relatively small scale operations? So I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So on the left, of course, and you probably intuitively picked up on this, on the left of the slide, this is an indoor grow. This is a large warehouse. On the right, you see what might be a typical outdoor grow, particularly in this sort of Northern California, Southern Oregon region. The advantage of indoor growing, of course, is that you can control the conditions. Right, outside, you're subject to the whims of nature. You're subject to the temperature of the atmosphere, any precipitation that might occur. In the last few years in California, and really many places in the American West, smoke damage from wildfires, traveling over hundreds of miles, and so on. Indoors, you really don't have to worry about much of that, right? You can control everything. You can control the lights when they come on, how bright they are, what type of lights they are. You can control the soil, control the water. There's, an increasing move towards quote unquote smart farming, in which all these conditions are being constantly monitored and inputs are being adjusted. Another advantage to indoor farming is where it can be located. 99% of farmland or cropland in the United States is owned by white landowners. So when we think about making the cannabis industry more equitable or ensuring that cannabis cultivation can be done by many different communities, not just historic farming communities, it's an advantage that you could potentially grow indoors in areas that were not traditionally conceived of as farmland. In addition to that, if we believe that it's valuable to have cannabis produced or cultivated locally, or if consumers in the market appreciate having local cannabis, much like you might imagine the craft beer industry, where you sort of go to a new city. If you like beer, you often might gravitate towards a beer that's produced locally. There's evidence that the cannabis market supports that as well. Unfortunately, not every region supports outdoor cultivation, particularly in more humid areas. It can be more challenging, or more likely, your plants are more likely to be at risk of mold or mildew or insects and other pests. Not every place is as nice to grow in as Northern California. So if we want our cannabis to be grown locally, if we want it to be grown in places that haven't historically been farmland, then indoor cultivation provides some advantages. Of course, major downside to indoor cultivation are the costs, the operating costs. You heard in our previous presentation on international cannabis law, our presenter highlighted how expensive it can be. You're essentially getting photosynthesis from the sun for free in sort of a outdoor cannabis farm. Indoors, you're having to pay for that energy. You often have to pay for the sort of municipal water supply. You have to pay for the soil. You have to pay for all your inputs. And it's nice to be able to control those inputs and to be able to control the growing conditions, but it's also very, very expensive. And so that is a major challenge. And it remains to be seen if indoor cultivation will be financially sustainable into the future. Now, I say that, and I think it's worth pointing out that people have been predicting the demise of indoor cultivation for quite some time, and we still see it dominant in many areas. It's predominantly indoor cultivation taking place in Canada, primarily indoor cultivation in states such as Colorado. It's indoor cultivation that is, what is licensed to be produced in Louisiana. All right, so there's still some advantages to indoor cultivation. Law enforcement and politicians tend to like indoor cultivation because it means, none of us have to see these, big bad plants, and we don't have to look at cannabis farms. For why that's objectionable, I'm not exactly sure, but it seems to be favored in some states for that reason, or at least partly that reason. Let me talk about outdoor farms. I've been contrasting outdoor farms with indoor grows so far, but just to be explicit here, very nice when you are in a region that supports outdoor cannabis cultivation. It is such a luxury to be able to draw your sunlight from the sun, to be able to draw that for free, to be able to put your plants directly into the soil. Now, a lot of outdoor grows still use or still truck in soil or soil inputs, but you can at least allow your plants to grow or put their roots down into sort of open soil. In some areas, you can use existing water rights that farms might already have to sort of irrigate and add water inputs to those plants or to those grows. And so it can be a lower cost of operation and perhaps a bit more sustainable from an environmental perspective than an indoor grow where you're bringing in everything and trying to reproduce those natural inputs. What you're seeing on the right here is what's called a DEP, or a light deprivation cultivation method. So you see these sort of rings with a grower pulling a tarp over the top of them. Probably this is around 6 p.m. in the evening. Why do outdoor growers sometimes do this? Well, because it tricks those plants into believing that the days are shorter than they actually are. So you could put your plants in the ground at the beginning of May, and in a few weeks after they start vegging out and they get tall enough, you start pulling tarps on them at 6 p.m. And that way they think it's actually autumn. It's maybe September or October, according to the plants, as far as they're concerned, which means they start producing those buds that we want for harvest. And by doing that, you can put your plants in the ground in May, harvest at the end of June, and then put new plants in the ground in July, harvest at the end of August. If you're really ambitious, you could get 3 dep runs in a growing season. Most people do around 2. And so you end up having a little bit of, the best of both worlds. You get the sort of free sunlight and other natural inputs by growing outside, but you can still control some of those growing conditions, or the advantages that you would get with sort of an indoor growing operation. And now there's still some, of course, some other disadvantages to these outdoor grows. Again, you don't have that same control. So yeah, I mean, you get sunlight from the sun for free, but you're more vulnerable to unexpected rains that might produce mildew. And might damage your crop. You're more vulnerable to smoke, especially the last few years. Some crops in sort of areas that have been affected by wildfire, or where smoke really sits around for weeks or even months, some of those buds get heavily damaged and end up smelling like smoke. They become much less marketable. And so I hesitate to say that you can't really grow for free, right? You still need to sort of take steps to protect your crops, and occasionally you're just a little bit more vulnerable, and your yield takes a hit because you're more vulnerable to these sort of natural conditions. And as I mentioned, perhaps the biggest downside to the sort of outdoor cultivation method, you can't do it everywhere. It's simply too difficult, or the growing conditions are not conducive. You might be able to grow cannabis, marijuana, what have you, but it's not going to sort of reach the standard that consumers increasingly expect. And so that is, I think, will continue to be an advantage. A third cultivation method is a little bit of both, and that's mixed light or mixed use cultivation, essentially growing in a greenhouse. Greenhouse is nice. You can get that sunlight, that free photosynthesis, without having to bring in supplemental lights, or sometimes you might have some supplemental lights, and you're able to sort of control some of the growing conditions, if not all of the growing conditions. Downsides, again, you can't control as much, and it's a little bit more expensive than pure outdoor cultivation. But within the cannabis agriculture space, there is a hot debate, and perhaps you all have been a part of it. And I think we've even heard some of our presenters allude to it as to what the future of cannabis agriculture in the United States or around the world is going to look like. Is it going to be indoors in these warehouses? Is it going to be outdoor, people doing light depths? Or is it going to be in greenhouses and so on? And I've been thinking about that question for the last 5 years, and so far both methods continue to be alive and well. They're both producing strongly, being licensed legally in states where that's possible. And so I think it is premature to predict the demise of one or the other. It is true that there may be, at a time when countries are legalizing on the national level and the international cannabis trade is possible, certainly true that there will be countries where outdoor cultivation on a large scale will be possible and much cheaper than sort of indoor cultivation that you might see in sort of your local scene. However, we don't have a lot of evidence of that those cannabis products being able to be transported or shipped or produced in trade, and while remaining high quality. And so I think it's still too soon to predict that large-scale outdoor cultivation is going to become the dominant method, especially when I think at least now you see a lot of sort of policymakers and law enforcement preferring this sort of indoor method. And I'm just seeing in the chat coming through a comment that indoor grow is better, right? And I think you have consumers that have a preference for one or another. I think in many cases, I think some people think that or tend to believe that indoor cultivation produces higher quality cannabis. On the other hand, I know a lot of consumers prefer that sort of sun-grown cannabis, the cannabis that's grown outdoors under the light of the sun. I think there's still strong demand for both. For the time being, I think both will continue to be alive and well. But it's a fascinating and I think healthy debate, and one that I think is worth not just debating for the sake of argument or consumer preferences, but also thinking about from a policy perspective, taking into consideration environmental factors, equity factors, allowing people to participate in this industry. I think we have to think about how the plant is cultivated and what makes sense for different communities. Now, the second part of industry structure that I want to talk about is scale. Starting around 2014, 2015, 2016, especially in 2016, when California voted to legalize recreational marijuana, you started seeing a flood of news articles and people talking about quote unquote big marijuana, right, or corporate cannabis, right? The idea that with legalization comes the inevitable that corporations are going to step in. They are going to take over the industry. They're going to grow a commodity, flood the market with this commodity of this cannabis commodity, and drive all the small scale cannabis farmers out of business. And people have been sort of saying that this is just an inevitability. It's just a matter of time. And part of my research and part of the sort of effort I made by writing my book and other research articles has been to push back on that a little bit. In my opinion, it's not inevitable. And there are steps that markets, that communities, that consumers, that farmers can take to ensure that a different approach to cultivation can still survive and even thrive in the future cannabis industry. There's a gentleman named Jonathan Calkins. He's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University who's done some research on cannabis agriculture and with respect to scale, crunched the numbers, and it sort of essentially suggests that the entire the demand for cannabis in the United States could be met if we're all consuming the same thing from the same place by simply 1, 2, or 3 10,000 acre cannabis farms. Now, 10,000 acres for cannabis is a huge amount. Cannabis yields an incredibly high amount of money per acre, and so 10,000 acres is just a massive amount. It's a very densely produced plant compared to other agricultural commodities in the United States. So it begs the question, could a few 10,000 acre farms just dominate the market and supply all of us Americans with all the cannabis that we need and drive all these other farms out of business? Well, personally, I think it's possible, but not likely. And there's a few reasons why. First, one of the sort of ironic dynamics of federal prohibition coupled with state legalization is that the feds, while they're sort of more or less, again, I don't want to raise any or ruffle any feathers here, but more or less hands off with states with respect to sort of the state programs, is that each individual state that legalizes cannabis cultivation in some way has to do so in state. The feds still really care about interstate commerce of cannabis, right? That still remains illegal. You can't really trade across state lines, which means that as long as this federal prohibition remains in place, while states continue to legalize, all these states are creating their own sort of in-house roster of cannabis farms, cannabis cultivation sites. And so when that day comes, when federal legalization occurs, the status quo is not going to be 5, 10,000 acre farms owned by the same corporation. The status quo is going to be thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of relatively small scale cannabis growing operations across the United States and in many different communities. So when that happens, I think there will be an incentive, there already is an incentive for those growers and for the sort of policymakers and politicians that represent them to protect those industries, to protect those economies. Places like California, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, where the economies are hugely driven by cannabis cultivation and sales, they have an incentive to ensure that their economies and that their farmers remain in business. So then it's worth thinking about how that might happen. I think one of the another sort of roadblock, so to speak, to the commoditization of cannabis is that while we often talk about cannabis as this like single product or as this agricultural commodity, if you will, the sort of defining characteristic of a commodity is that it's not distinctive, right? You can sort of trade it as a unit, and sort of one barrel of wheat or unit of wheat will be the same, regardless of where it comes from, which is technically, of course, not true, but that's how a commodity market works, or what it assumes anyway. And if anyone is an active cannabis consumer, or if you're doing research on the cannabis industry, certainly you already know that the idea that cannabis is this one single product is laughable, right? We have already 4 figures, at least, thousands of individual strains of marijuana that have been identified. And part of the reason we have so many is that cannabis or marijuana is very easy to sort of pollinate or cross-pollinate and create hybrid strains. And within that, by creating those strains, I think you create a consumer base that also cares about the strains and wants to try different strains. You've seen in the cannabis market a sort of connoisseur market spring up, in which people, are talking about the hottest strains of the day, or sort of talking to each other about what strains they've tried, or this one is good for migraines, this one is good for going for a hike, this one is good for studying, that kind of thing. And so for me, the idea that the market's going to get flooded with this generic commodity just isn't really responsive, or isn't recognizing that the market as it is already creating demand for differentiation and unique products. And I think so for that reason, I think that is unlikely, or that sort of commoditization is unlikely to take place. Now, there could be both, and I think that might be the likely outcome, that we have this sort of generic strains or generic commodities of cannabis that enter the market, are used cheaply for things like extracts or other edibles where you're not maybe handling the raw flower. But I think for at least the foreseeable future, I have a hard time believing that the market is going to settle on one of these strains as the cannabis commodity. Then finally, I think we also see a preference in the United States for that sort of small scale, perhaps more sustainable, perhaps more locally grown cannabis. I think people like that. You see in the beer industry, for example, those macro brews are certainly doing very well for themselves, but so is the craft beer market. And I think the cannabis market might evolve similarly, where you have, the sort of the cheap products available alongside with the craft or artisanal products that are maybe a little bit more expensive, but cater to a slightly different clientele. And I think that's a good thing. If we believe that there is, medicinal, spiritual, recreational value to cannabis, I think it's good that we are providing the public, or can provide the public, with some of those products that are healthy and sustainable, but also at a lower price point. And I also think it's good to have a diversity of products and cannabis available that maybe cater to a different market, have some unique characteristics. So for these reasons, I don't believe in the sort of big marijuana takeover. I don't believe that it's inevitable. I think there's a lot of incentive for existing growers and policymakers to resist that. I think consumers and consumer behavior and consumer choices so far don't really reflect that. And so I don't think that that is an inevitability in the sort of cannabis agriculture space. Let me move on to the second topic, which is state licensing, which is largely what is driving cannabis agriculture and what it looks like today, what it looks like into the future. So far, we're seeing basically a contrast between two different approaches. Now, what's interesting about the federal prohibition is that every state is adopting its own approach to cannabis agriculture, to cannabis licensing. And so in a way, it's creating these, these so-called laboratories of democracy are they've, in my opinion, never been better demonstrated than in the cannabis industry, where each state is unique and trying its own thing. And I think when we look back 10, 15, 20 years from now, we'll be able to draw on a lot of these approaches and say that this state did is worked well, and this other state, that approach didn't work well for this reason. We can sort of start to develop some best practices. I think for now, we're still trying to figure out what is working and what isn't. But a couple different approaches that have emerged. One is the sort of limited licensing approach versus open licensing. What I mean by limited licensing is many states, when they legalize, they don't just sort of open the floor, so to speak, or open the floodgates for anybody to be able to produce or cultivate cannabis, hemp, marijuana, whatever the case may be. They sort of say, look, we're going to issue 12 licenses, and you can apply to be one of those lucky 12. This was the approach when New York first legalized medicinal marijuana, when Florida legalized medicinal marijuana. And I have up here on the slide on the left, the state of Ohio. It's 2015 marijuana legalization initiative. It would have created a constitutional amendment legalizing marijuana cultivation, retail sale, and use. And in that constitutional amendment, in other words, in the Constitution of Ohio, as proposed by this initiative, were the 12 businesses that were going to be able to be licensed. And it was only those 12, and they were going to be in the Constitution of the state. So this created a bit of a dilemma for legalization advocates, right? Sort of think, well, yeah, we want it to be legalized, but we don't want to create this monopoly or oligopoly for only 12 really well-connected, as you can imagine, not very diverse group of businesses. And the initiative ended up failing. And the sort of post-mortem analysis was that the people really didn't like that this was being sort of co-opted by a few very well-connected companies. Nonetheless, there's some attractive qualities or aspects to this for the state. Obviously, it's nice that they only have to monitor a handful of businesses. They only have to be in touch with a handful of businesses. Everybody else is still in the illicit market and can be addressed the same way we've addressed illicit growers and businesses in the past. But we can sort of engage with the sort of legal businesses and legal licensees very easily this way. So the administrative burden is much lower. The downside, obviously, is that it's not very equitable. Most of the time, the companies that are getting these licenses, as I mentioned, they're well capitalized. They're politically well connected. They're not representing a diversity of communities, and so it's not a very equitable approach. Contrast that with the sort of open licensing approach that you see in other states, such as California, where they just say, here's the standards you need to meet. You need to do X, Y, and Z. And if you do those things, then we'll give you a license. And there's not really an upper limit or a cap on who can receive those licenses. The advantage to that, it's a lot more, at least on the surface, it's more equitable. And you ensure that people who can meet those standards can participate. The challenge for the state is that it's a huge administrative burden. A report came out a couple of years ago estimating that there are over 70,000 marijuana growers in the state of California alone. 70,000, at least 70,000. That was a couple of years ago. Now, this includes, relatively small scale growing operations, but you can begin to see the scale of the challenge for state administrators trying to deal with that many grows. Now, of course, not all of them are trying to enter the legal market and receive licenses, but the administrative burden is pretty massive. I say that, at least on the surface, it's more equitable because in reality, in many of these states, the burdens they're putting on many of these cannabis businesses are incredibly large. They're expecting a lot. The investment that you have to put in order to get through legal licensing, particularly in the state of California. I know one relatively small scale farmer that has already put in over $100,000, sort of making adjustments, buying a water tank, paving a road, deforesting here, foresting there, doing the sort of trying to jump through the hoops that the sort of local county officials are making those farmers go through, and still doesn't have his license. And part of, I think, the problem with that is a sort of decentralized approach that you see in California, where a lot of these really massive decisions as to who gets the licenses and who doesn't are being done by local officials that in defense of them, have never dealt with the cannabis industry and haven't been trained and what the needs might be for the community, for the environment, for the grower and the market and the consumers, and so on. So the burden is large. Now, I want to point out two really unique models before I move on. One is, of course, Louisiana, that many of you are probably familiar with. I typically criticize states that provide these limited licensing approaches because, again, I don't think it's very equitable, and you end up funneling a lot of those profits to well-connected companies in a very limited way. But of course, Louisiana's approach, limiting cultivation to our sort of agricultural land grant universities, Southern University and LSU, really novel approach. Not familiar with other states trying that, but I think if states do want the sort of limited administrative burden, just at least to begin with, maybe working with agricultural universities does have some advantages. You're at least not subject as much to the criticism that you're sort of creating monopolies or oligopolies in these sort of well-connected private companies. And the second model I want to point out is, again, in California, and that's the sort of development of what are being called marijuana appellations. So you're probably familiar with appellations in the wine context. When you buy a bottle of wine and it says Napa Valley on it, that is an appellation. That is a certified designation of origin. A government agency ensures that when a bottle of wine says Napa Valley, that the grapes that were grown to produce that wine actually came from Napa Valley. And there are many advantages to this. Number one, it diversifies the marketplace. So we don't have, in the wine industry, just red wine and white wine and rosé and champagne, right? We have red wine from Napa Valley and from Bordeaux and from Chile and from everywhere, right? And so instead of having these sort of generic products, we have thousands of different products. And as a consumer, it's fun, it's interesting. You can engage with the industry in a deeper way. You can try products from various regions. From the perspective of those agricultural regions, of course, it provides some protection, right? It ensures that, your product is unique. You're not just producing red wine in this generic sense. You're producing red wine from Napa Valley. And you can get even more specific than that. And there's a lot of advantages to this for cannabis for sort of parallel reasons, especially, historically strong growing regions or growing regions with a strong reputation, such as, for example, Humboldt County. If Humboldt County sort of takes steps to ensure that only Humboldt County cannabis can advertise itself as Humboldt County, then it's differentiating itself in the marketplace. It's less vulnerable to that sort of commoditization or flooding of a generic product. Otherwise, who's to stop someone, from Fresno growing in their basement, labeling their cannabis and saying it's Humboldt County and taking advantage of the good reputation that Humboldt County has in the cannabis space. And for consumers, finally, again, we have a more diversified marketplace. We have more products out there on the market. And when I first started writing about this, I threw this out in a law review article, and I think 2017, and I proposed it again in my book, and a lot of people sort of laughed off the idea. But on the right here is a map of Mendocino County in Northern California. This was developed by the Mendocino Appalachians Project. And in the last couple of years, the state of California's Department of Agriculture and their cannabis licensing agency have collaborated, put together an appellation system. And last year, they put out their notice of proposed rulemaking, outlining the sort of framework of what an appellation system would look like for the state. So this would appear to be a system that is being put in place in the state of California. I think it'll have advantages elsewhere around the country. Again, thinking about that sort of the wine industry or the beer industry as parallels, consumers seem to like trying things from different places. So I think there's advantages, even if you're not a growing region like Humboldt County that has this established reputation. It's still interesting, right? Still, people might want to try cannabis from a particular region, particularly when they're in that region. So I think there's a lot of promise to this appellation system. It's being put in place in California. I think it has advantages elsewhere. It probably will take a long time to sort of take root nationally, but watch out for this and maybe consider this as a potential future aspect of cannabis agriculture. And the last point I want to mention, and that is a topic that doesn't get as much play. We're talking increasingly about equity challenges in the cannabis industry and in the cannabis agriculture space. We have been, people that do research or are interested in this area have been talking about it in terms of who is getting the licenses, who owns the farmland, and et cetera, and so on. And I think those are great conversations to be having. Less attention being paid to who's doing the farm work. And I think this is a community that is particularly vulnerable. Even in, and I've sort of seen a number of cannabis grows in California and Oregon that are legally licensed, but nonetheless, their workers are still working under the table. Right, so it's and of course the unlicensed grows, the workers are growing under the table as well. The sort of pattern here is, and what you see a lot is, people from around the world will, including the United States, will come to our grows, our farming operations during the summer and particularly during the fall harvest in order to help with trimming. So when that harvest comes in, when you cut those buds off the plant, the buds come with, stems, leaves. Sometimes they're not ideally seeds, and it's a trimmer's job to take that sort of raw product coming off the plant and turn it into the beautiful, consistent buds that the consumers know and love. Now that's a pretty labor-intensive process. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of skill and expertise. It involves, sitting down for hours and doing kind of the same motion over and over. It can be hard physically, and in almost no case are trimmers provide any type of health insurance. Most of the time, I suppose I don't have the data to back up most, but much of the time, they're sort of folks coming from abroad or across our borders, and working without sort of a work visa, right? So that they're in a vulnerable position. These are migrant laborers, and they're working in a sort of unlicensed or illicit industry, even when it's a licensed grow. Most of the time, or at every instance that I've seen, these are not sort of on the payroll employees, so to speak. Now, I don't want to portray this as this sort of really dark, awful situation. And many of these grows, many of these farms, it's great, right? You can come to California, you can trim for a few months, you can make, $10, $15, $20, $30,000 in cash, and then go back to wherever you came from and sort of, come back the next year and do it all over again. But when you're dealing with an industry that has very little oversight and is mostly unregulated, it creates certain vulnerabilities. There are many horror stories of trimmers getting taken advantage of, doing the work for an entire season and then not getting their pay, or being provided with unfortunate, really deplorable living or working conditions. And I think this is an area that the cannabis agriculture industry needs to pay a little bit more attention to. Again, I think we do need to focus on the businesses and the licensees and who holds those, and making sure that that's not being concentrated or dominated only by the privileged few. But we also need to think about farm workers and this vulnerable community of trimmers that come participate in the cannabis industry every year and are not very well represented or not very well thought about, really by policymakers, or even by the industry, and often by the growers themselves. So it's 3:20. I wanted to leave some time for Q&A. Just to recap, I've talked about the industry structure, growing both indoors versus outdoors, and the advantages that each approach have, as well as the scale of cannabis agriculture and what the future cannabis farm is going to look like. Is it going to be small, artisanal craft cannabis grown locally, or is it going to be this huge 10,000 acre cannabis farm? I talked about state licensing and the influence that has over who gets licenses and who doesn't. Limited licensing versus open licensing, and then sort of highlighting the Louisiana system as well as California's Appalachian program. And then finally talked a little bit about cannabis farm workers and the sort of situation that trimmers find themselves in, and the need for more attention to their welfare and well-being. I would welcome any questions at this time, and thank you all for listening and for attending this session.
I'm looking in the question and answer section, Professor Stoa, and no one has a question. All righty. Well, I appreciate all of you being here and for your attention. It's always a delight to speak about this agricultural topic. And once again, I'd like to thank Kejel and Marla for organizing this and making this so smooth. It's been wonderful to be here, and I appreciate having the opportunity and the platform for this discussion. Okay, we appreciate you, Professor Stoa. Thank you, and you have a good day.